Story 10 of Cape Cod Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Cape Cod Stories by Joseph C. Lincoln. Story 10, His Native Heath. I never could quite understand why the folks at Wellmouth made me selectman. I s'pose likely 'twas on account of Jonadab and me and Peter Brown making such a go of the old home house and turning Wellmouth Port from a sand flea's paradise into a hospital where city folks could have their bank accounts amputated and not suffer more'n was necessary. Anyway, I was elected unanimous at town meeting, and Peter was mighty anxious for me to take the job. "Barzilla," says Peter, "I jedge that a selectman is a sort of dwarf alderman. Now, I've had friends who've been aldermen, and they say it's a sure thing, like shaking with your own dice. If you're straight, there's the honor and the advertisement. If you're crooked, there's the graft. Either way, the house wins. Go in and glory be with you." So I finally agreed to serve, and the very first meeting I went to the question of Asaph Blueworthy and the poorhouse comes up. Zoeth Tiddit, he was town clerk, he puts it this way: "Gentlemen," he says, "we have here the usual application from Asaph Blueworthy for aid from the town. I don't know's there's much use for me to read it. It's tolerable familiar. Suffering from lumbago and rheumatiz. Yes. Out of work. Just so. Respectfully begs that the board will, et cetera, and so forth. Well, gentlemen, what's your pleasure?" Darius Gott, he speaks first, and dry and drawling as ever. "Out of work, hey?" says Darius. "Mr. Chairman, I should like to ask if anybody here remembers the time when Asa was in work?" Nobody did, and Captain Benijah Poundberry, he was chairman at that time, he fetches the table a welt with his starboard fist and comes out emphatic. "Feller members," says he, "I don't know how the rest of you feel, but it's my opinion that this board has done too much for that lazy loafer already. Long's his sister Thankful lived we couldn't say nothing, of course. If she wanted to slave and work so's her brother could live in idleness and sloth, why, that was her business. There ain't any law against a body making a fool of herself, more's the pity. But she's been dead a year, and he's done nothing since but live on those that'll trust him and ask help from the town. He ain't sick, except sick of work. Now that's my idea, that long's he's bound to be a pauper, he might as well be treated as a pauper. Let's send him to the poorhouse." "But," says I, "he owns his place down there by the shore, don't he?" All hands laughed that is, all but Cap'n Benijah. "Own nothing," says the cap'n. "The whole rat trap from the keel to main truck ain't worth more'n $300, and I loaned Thankful $400 on it years ago, and the mortgage fell due last September. Not a cent of principal, interest, nor rent have I got since. Whether he goes to the poorhouse or not, he goes out of that house of mine to morrer. A man can smite me on one cheek and maybe I'll turn t'other, but when, after I have turned it, he finds fault 'cause my face hurts his hand, then I rise up and quit. You hear me?" Nobody could help hearing him, 'less he was deefer than the feller that fell out of the balloon and couldn't hear himself strike. So all hands agreed that sending Asaph Blueworthy to the poorhouse would be a good thing. 'Twould be a lesson to Asa, and would give the poorhouse one more excuse for being on earth. Wellmouth's a fairly prosperous town, and the paupers had died, one after the other, and no new ones had come, until all there was left in the poorhouse was old Betsy Mullen, who was down with creeping palsy, and Deborah Badger, who'd been keeper ever since her husband died. The poorhouse property was valuable, too, 'specially for a summer cottage, being out on the end of Robbins Point, away from the town, and having a fine view right across the bay. Zoeth Tiddit was a committee of one with power from the town to sell the place, but he hadn't found a customer yet. And if he did sell it, what to do with Debbie was more or less of a question. She'd kept poorhouse for years and had no other home nor no relations to go to. Everybody liked her, too. That is, everybody but Cap'n Benijah. He was down on her 'cause she was a spiritualist and believed in fortune tellers and such. The cap'n, being a deacon of the come outer persuasion, was naturally down on folks who wasn't broad-minded enough to see that his particular crack in the roof was the only way to crawl through to glory. Well, we voted to send Asaph to the poorhouse, and then I was appointed a delegate to see him and tell him he'd got to go. I wasn't enthusiastic over the job, but everybody said I was exactly the feller for the place. "To tell you the truth," drawls Darius, "you, being a stranger, are the only one that Ase couldn't talk over. He's got a tongue that's buttered on both sides and runs on ball bearings. If I could see him he'd work on my sympathies till I'd lend him the last 2-cent piece in my baby's bank." So, as there wa'n't no way out of it, I drove down to Asaph's that afternoon. He lived off on a side road by the shore, in a little run down shanty that was as no account as he was. When I moored my horse to the heavenly wood tree by what was left of the fence, I would have bet my sou'wester that I caught a glimpse of Brother Blueworthy peeking round the corner of the house. But when I turned that corner there was nobody in sight, although the busted wash bench, with a cranberry crate propping up its lame end, was shaking a little, as if some one had set on it recent. I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. After knocking 3 or 4 times I tried kicking, and the second kick raised, from somewheres inside, a groan that was as lonesome a sound as ever I heard. No human noise in my experience come within a mile of it for dead, downright misery, unless maybe it's Captain Jonadab trying to sing in meeting Sundays. "Who's that?" wails Asa from t'other side of the door. "Did anybody knock?" "Knock!" says I. "I all but kicked your everlasting derelict out of water. It's me, Wingate, one of the selectmen. Tumble up there. I want to talk to you." Blueworthy didn't exactly tumble, so's to speak, but the door opened and he come shuffling and groaning into sight. His face was twisted up and he had one hand spread fingered on the small of his back. "Dear, dear," says he, "I'm dreadfully sorry to have kept you waiting, Mr. Wingate. I've been wrastling with this terrible lumbago, and I'm 'fraid it's affecting my hearing. I'll tell you—" "Yes, well, you needn't mind," says I. "'Cording to common tell, you was born with that same kind of lumbago, and it's been getting no better fast ever since. Jest drag your suffering out onto this bench and come to anchor. I've got considerable to say, and I'm in a hurry." Well, he grunted and groaned and scruffled along. When he got planted on the bench he didn't let up any, kept on with the misery. "Look here," says I, losing patience. "When you get through with the Job business I'll heave ahead and talk. Don't let me interrupt the lamentations on no account." "Finished? All right now, you listen to me." And then I told him just how matters stood. His house was to be seized on the mortgage, and he was to move to the poorhouse next day. You never see a man more surprised or worse cut up. Him to the poorhouse! Him, one of the oldest families on the Cape! You'd think he was the Grand Panjandrum. Well, the dignity didn't work, so he commenced on the lumbago, and that didn't work neither. But do you think he give up the ship? Not much. He commenced to explain why he hadn't been able to earn a living and the reasons why he'd ought to have another chance. Talk! Well, if I hadn't been warned he'd have landed me all right. I never heard a better sermon nor one with more long words in it. I actually pitied him. It seemed a shame that a feller who could argue like that should have to go to the poorhouse. He'd ought to run a summer hotel. When the boarders kicked 'cause there was yeller-eyed beans in the coffee, he would be the one to explain that they was lucky to get beans like that without paying extra for 'em. Thinks I'm an idiot, but I'll make him one more offer. So I says, "See here, Mr. Blueworthy, I could use another man at the stable in the Old Home House. If you want the job, you can have it. Only you'll have to work, and work hard." Well, sir, would you believe it? His face fell like a cook book cake. That kind of chance wa'n't what he was looking for. He shuffled and hitched round, and finally he says, "I'll consider your offer," he says. That was too many for me. "Well, I'll be darned," says I, and went off and left him considering. I don't know what his considerations amounted to. All I know is that next day they took him to the poorhouse. And from now on this yarn has got to be more or less hearsay. I'll have to put this and that together, like the woman that made the mincemeat. Some of the facts I got from a cousin of Deborah Badger's. Some of them I wormed out of Asaph himself one time when he'd had a jug come down from the city and was feeling tolerable philanthropic and conversation-y. But I guess they're straight enough. Seems that, while I was down notifying Blueworthy, Captain Pondberry had gone over to the poorhouse to tell the Widow Badger about her new boarder. The widow was glad to hear the news. "He'll be somebody to talk to, at any rate," says she. "Poor old Betsy Mullen ain't exactly what you'd call company for a sociable body. But I'll mind what you say, Captain Benijah. It takes more than a slick tongue to come it over me. I'll make that lazy man work or know the reason why." So when Asaph arrived, per truck wagon, at 3 o'clock the next afternoon, Mrs. Badger was ready for him. She didn't wait to shake hands or say, "Glad to see you." No, sir. The minute he landed she sent him out by the barn with orders to chop a couple of cords of oak slabs that was piled there. He groaned and commenced to develop lumbago symptoms, but she cured him in a hurry by remarking that her doctor's book said vigorous exercise was the best physic for that kind of disease, and so he must chop hard. She waited till she heard the axe chunk once or twice, and then she went into the house, figuring that she'd gained the first lap anyhow. But in an hour or so it come over her all of a sudden that 'twas awful quiet out by the woodpile. She hurried to the back door, and there was Ace, setting on the ground in the shade, his eyes shut and his back against the chopping block, and one poor lonesome slab in front of him with a couple of splinters knocked off it. That was his afternoon's work. Maybe you think the widow wa'n't mad. She tiptoed out to the woodpile, grabbed her new boarder by the coat collar, and shook him till his head played Johnny Comes Marching Home against the chopping block. "You lazy thing, you!" says she, with her eyes snapping. "Wake up and tell me what you mean by sleeping when I told you to work." "Sleep?" stutters Asaph, kind of reaching out with his mind for a life preserver. I want to sleep." Well, I don't think he had really meant to sleep. I guess he just set down to think of a good brand new excuse for not working, and kind of drowsed off. "You wa'n't, hey?" says Deborah. "Then 'twas the best imitation ever I see. What WAS you doing, if 'tain't too personal a question?" I guess I must have fainted. I'm subject to such spells. You see, ma'am, I ain't been well for Yes, I know. I understand all about that. Now you march your boots into that house, where I can keep an eye on you, and help me get supper. Tomorrow morning you'll get up at 5 o'clock and chop wood till breakfast time. If I think you've chopped enough, maybe you'll get the breakfast. If I don't think so, you'll keep on chopping. Now march." Blueworthy, he marched, but 'twa'n't as joyful a parade as an Odd Fellows' picnic. He could see he'd made a miscue, a clean miss, and the white ball in the pocket. He knew, too, that a lot depended on his making a good impression the first thing, and instead of that he'd gone and "foozled his approach," as that city feller said last summer when he ran the catboat plump into the end of the pier. Deborah, she went out into the kitchen, but she ordered Ase to stay in the dining room and set the table, and told him to get the dishes out of the closet. All the time he was doing it he kept thinking about the mistake he'd made, and wondering if there wa'n't some way to square up and get solid with the widow. Asaph was a good deal of a philosopher, and his motto was, so he told me afterward, that time I spoke of when he'd been investigating the jug, his motto was, "Every hard shell has a soft spot somewheres, and after you find it, it's easy." If he could only find out something that Deborah Badger was particular interested in, then he believed he could make a 10 strike. And all at once, down in the corner of the closet, he see a big pile of papers and magazines. The one on top was the Banner of Light, and underneath that was the Mysterious Magazine. Then he remembered, all of a sudden, the town talk about Debbie's believing in mediums and spooks and fortune tellers and such, and he commenced to set up and take notice. At the supper table he was as mum as a run down clock, just sat in his chair and looked at Mrs. Badger. She got nervous and fidgety after a spell, and finally busts out with, "What are you staring at me like that for?" Asa kind of jumped and looked surprised. "Staring?" says he. "Was I staring?" "I should think you was. Is my hair coming down, or what is it?" He didn't answer for a minute, but he looked over her head and then away across the room, as if he was watching something that moved. "Your husband was a short, kind of fleshy man, as I remember, wa'n't he?" says he, absent-minded like. "Course he was. But what in the world—" "'Twa'n't him, then. I thought not." "Him? My husband? What do you mean?" And then Asaph begun to put on the fine touches. He leaned across the table, and says he, in a sort of mysterious whisper: "Mrs. Badger," says he, "do you ever see things? Not common things, but strange, shadders like." "Mercy me!" says the widow. "No. Do you?" "Sometimes seems if I did. Jest now, as I sat here looking at you, it seemed as if I saw a man come up and put his hand on your shoulder." Well, you can imagine Debbie. She jumped out of her chair and whirled around like a kitten in a fit. "Good land!" she hollers. "Where? What? Who was it?" I don't know who 'twas. His face was covered up. But it kind of come to me, a communication, as you might say, that some day that man was going to marry you. "Land o' love! Marry me? You're crazy." "I'm scared to death." Asa shook his head, more mysterious than ever. "I don't know," says he. "Maybe I am crazy, but I see that same man this afternoon when I was in that trance, and—" "Trance? Do you mean to tell me you was in a trance out there by the woodpile? Are you a medium?" Well, Asa, he wouldn't admit that he was a medium exactly, but he give her to understand that there wa'n't many mediums in this country that could do business 'longside of him when he was really working. Course, he made believe he didn't want to talk about such things, and likewise, of course, that made Debbie all the more anxious to talk about them. She found out that her new boarder was subject to trances and had second sight and could draw horoscopes, and I don't know what all. Particular, she wanted to know more about that man that was going to marry her, but Asaph wouldn't say much about him. "All I can say is," says Ase, "that he didn't appear to me like a common man. He was sort of familiar looking, and yet there was something distinguished about him, something uncommon, as you might say. But this much comes to me strong: he's a man any woman would be proud to get, and sometime he's coming to offer you a good home. You won't have to keep poorhouse all your days." So the widow went up to her room with what you might call a case of delightful horrors. She was too scart to sleep and frightened to stay awake. She kept 2 lamps burning all night. As for Asaph, he waited till 'twas still, and then he crept downstairs to the closet, got an armful of banners of light and mysterious magazines, and went back to his room to study up. Next morning there was nothing said about wood chopping. Ase was busy making preparations to draw Debbie's horoscope. You can see how things went after that. Blueworthy was star boarder at that poorhouse. Mrs. Badger was too much interested in spooks and fortunes to think of asking him to work, and if she did hint at such a thing he'd have another trance and see that man and 'twas all off. And we poor fools of selectmen was congratulating ourselves that Asa Blueworthy was doing something toward earning his keep at last. And then, 'long in July 'twas, Betsy Mullen died. One evening, just after the 4th, Deborah and Asaph was in the dining room, figuring out fortunes with a pack of cards, when there comes a knock at the door. The widow answered it, and there was an old chap, dressed in a blue suit, and a stunning pretty girl in what these summer women make believe is a sea-going rig, and both of 'em was sopping wet through and as miserable as 2 hens in a rain barrel. Turned out that the man's name was Lamont, with a colonel's pennant and $1 million mark on the foretop of it, and the girl was his daughter, Mabel. They'd been paying $6 a day each for sea air and clam soup over to the Wattagonset House in harness, and either the soup or the air had affected the colonel's head till he imagined he could sail a boat all by his ownty donty. Well, he'd sailed one across the bay and got becalmed, and then the tide took him in amongst the shoals at the mouth of Wellmouth Crick, and there, owing to a mix-up of tide, shoal, dark, and an overdose of foolishness, the boat had upset and foundered, and the Lamonts had waded half a mile or so to shore. Once on dry land, they'd headed up the bluff for the only port in sight, which was the poorhouse, although they didn't know it. The widow and Asaph made 'em as comfortable as they could, rigged 'em up in dry clothes which had belonged to departed paupers, and got 'em something to eat. The Lamonts was what they called enchanted with the whole establishment. "This," says the colonel, with his mouth full of brown bread, "is delightful, really delightful, the New England hospitality that we read about, so free from ostentation and conventionality." When you stop to think of it, you'd scarcely expect to run across such ostentation at the poorhouse, but of course the colonel didn't know, and he praised everything so like Sam Hill that the widow was ashamed to break the news to him. And Ase kept quiet, too, you can be sure of that. As for Mabel, she was one of them gushy, goo-gooey kind of girls, and she was as struck with the shebang as her dad. She said the house itself was a perfect dear. And after supper they paired off and got to talking, the colonel with Mrs. Badger and Asaph with Mabel. Now, I can just imagine how Ase talked to that poor, unsuspecting young female. He sartin did love an audience, and here was one that didn't know him nor his history, nor nothing. He played the sad and mysterious. You could see that he was a blighted bud, all right. He was a man with a hidden sorrer, and the way he'd sigh and change the subject when it come to embarrassing questions was enough to bring tears to a graven image, let alone a romantic girl just out of boarding school. Then, after a spell of this, Mabel wanted to be shown the house, so as to see the sweet, old-fashioned rooms. And she wanted papa to see 'em, too. So Ase led the way, like the talking man in the dime museum. And the way them Lamonts agonized over every rag mat and corded bedstead was something past belief. When they were saying good night they HAD to stay all night because their own clothes wa'n't dry, and those they had on were more picturesque than stylish, Mabel turns to her father, and says she: "Papa, dear," she says, "I believe that at last we've found the very thing we've been looking for." And the colonel said yes, he guessed they had. Next morning they was up early and out enjoying the view. It IS about the best view along shore, and they had a fit over it. When breakfast was done, the Lamonts takes Ase one side, and the colonel says: "Mr. Blueworthy," he says, "my daughter and I are very much pleased with the Cape and the Cape people. Some time ago we made up our minds that if we could find the right spot we would build a summer home here. Preferably we wish to purchase a typical old-time colonial homestead and remodel it, retaining, of course, all the original old-fashioned flavor. Cost is not so much the consideration as location and the house itself. We are, well, frankly, your place here suits us exactly." "We adore it," says Mabel, emphatic. "Mr. Blueworthy," goes on the colonel, "will you sell us your home? I'm prepared to pay a liberal price." Poor Asaph was kind of throwed on his beam ends, so's to speak. He hemmed and hawed, and finally had to blurt out that he didn't own the place. The Lamonts was astonished. The colonel wanted to know if it belonged to Mrs. Badger. "Why, no," says Ase. "The fact is that is to say, you see—" And just then the widow opened the kitchen window and called to him. "Colonel Lamont," says she, "there's a sailboat beating up the harbor, and I think the folks on it are looking for you." The colonel excused himself and run off down the hill toward the back side of the point, and Asaph was left alone with the girl. He see, I s'pose, that here was his chance to make the best yarn out of what was bound to come out anyhow in a few minutes. So he fetched a sigh that sounded as if it 'twas racking loose the foundations, and commenced. He asked Mabel if she was prepared to hear something that would shock her terrible, something that would undermine her confidence in human natur'. She was a good deal upset, and no wonder, but she braced up and let on that she guessed she could stand it. So when he told her that her dad and her had been deceived, that house wa'n't his nor Mrs. Badger's, 'twas the Wellmouth Poor Farm, and he was a pauper. She was shocked, all right enough, but afore she had a chance to ask a question he begun to tell her the story of his life. 'Twas a fine chance for him to spread himself, and I cal'late he done it to the skipper's taste. He told her how him and his sister had lived in their little home, their own little nest, over there by the shore, for years and years. He led her out to where she could see the roof of his old shanty over the sand hills, and he wiped his eyes and raved over it. You'd think that tumble-down shack was a hunk out of paradise. Adam and Eve's place in the garden was a short lobster alongside of it. Then he said he was took down with an incurable disease. He tried and tried to get along, but 'twas no go. He mortgaged the shanty to a grasping money lender, meaning Poundberry, and that money was spent. Then his sister passed away and his heart broke, so they took him to the poorhouse. "Miss Lamont," says he, "good by. Sometimes in the midst of your fashionable career, in your gaiety and so forth, pause," he says, "and give a thought to the broken-hearted pauper who has told you his life tragedy." Well, now, you take a green girl, right fresh from novels and music lessons, and spring that on her, what can you expect? Mabel, she cried and took on dreadful. "Oh, Mr. Blueworthy," says she, grabbing his hand, "I'm so glad you told me. I'm so glad. Cheer up," she says. "I respect you more'n ever, and my father and I will—" Just then the colonel comes puffing up the hill. He looked as if he'd heard news. "My child," he says in a kind of horrified whisper, "can you realize that we have actually passed the night in the almshouse?" Mabel held up her hand. "Hush, papa," she says, "hush. I know all about it. Come away quick. I've got something very important to say to you." And she took her dad's arm and went off down the hill, mopping her pretty eyes with a handkerchief and smiling back every once in a while through her tears at Asaph. Now, it happened that there was a selectmen's meeting that afternoon at 4 o'clock. I was on hand, and so was Zoeth Tiddit and most of the others. Captain Poundberry and Darius Gott were late. Zoeth was as happy as a clam at high water. He'd sold the poorhouse property that very day to a Colonel Lamont from Harniss who wanted it for a summer place. "And I got the price we set on it, too," says Zoeth. But that wa'n't the funniest part of it. Seems old man Lamont and his daughter was very much upset because Debbie Badger and Asa Blueworthy would be turned out of house and home, 'count of the place being sold. The colonel was hotfoot for giving 'em a check for $500 to square things. Said his daughter made him promise he would. Says I, "You can give it to Debbie if you want to, but don't lay a copper on that Blueworthy fraud." Then I told him the truth about Asa. He couldn't hardly believe it, but I finally convinced him, and he made out the check to Debbie. I took it down to her myself just after dinner. Asa was there, and his eyes pretty nigh popped out of his head. "Look here," I says to him, "if you'd been worth a Continental you might have had some of this. As it is, you'll be farmed out somewheres. That's what'll happen to you." And as Zoeth was telling this, in comes Captain Benijah. He was happy, too. "I cal'late the Lamonts must be buying all the properties along shore," he says when he heard the news. "I sold that old shack that I took from Blueworthy to that Lamont girl to day for $350. She wouldn't say what she wanted of it, neither, and I didn't care much. I was glad to get rid of it." "I can tell you what she wanted of it," says somebody behind us. We turned round, and 'twas Gott. He'd come in. "I just met Squire Foster," he says, "and the squire tells me that Lamont girl come into his office with a bill of sale for the property you sold her, and made him deed it right over to Asa Blueworthy as a present from her." "What?" says all hands, Poundberry loudest of all. "That's right," said Darius. "She told the squire a long rigmarole about what a martyr Asa was, and how her dad was going to do something for him, but that she was going to give him his home back again with her own money her father had given her to buy a ring with, she said, though that ain't reasonable, of course. Nobody'd pay that much for a ring. The squire tried to tell her what a no good Asa was, but she froze him quicker'n Where are you going, Captain Benijah?" "I'm going down to that poorhouse," hollers Poundberry. "I'll find out the rights and wrongs of this thing mighty quick." We all said we'd go with him, and we went, 6 in one carryall. As we hove in sight of the poorhouse, a buggy drove away from it, going in t'other direction. "That looks like the Baptist minister's buggy," says Darius. "What on earth's he been down here for?" Nobody could guess. As we run alongside the poorhouse door, Asa Blueworthy stepped out, leading Debby Badger. She was as red as an auction flag. "By time, Asa Blueworthy," hollers Captain Benijah, starting to get out of the carryall. "What do you mean by Debby, what are you holding that rascal's hand for?" But Asa cut him short. "Captain Poundberry," he says, as dignified as a boy with a stiff neck, "I might pass over your remarks to me, but when you address my wife " "Your wife!" hollers everybody but the captain. He only sort of gurgled. "My wife," says Asaph. "When you men church members, too, some of you sold the house over her head, I'm proud to say that I, having a home once more, was able to step forward and ask her to share it with me. We was married a few minutes ago," he says. "And oh, Captain Poundberry," cried Debby, looking as if this was the most wonderful part of it, "oh, Captain Poundberry," she says, "we have known for a long time that some man, an uncommon kind of man, was coming to offer me a home some day, but even Asaph didn't know 'twas himself. Did you, Asaph?" We selectmen talked the thing over going home, but Captain Benijah didn't speak till we was turning in at his gate. Then he fetched his knee a thump with his fist, and says he, in the most disgusted tone ever I heard, "A house and a lot for nothing," he says. "A wife to do the work for him, and $500 to spend. Sometimes the way this world run gives me moral indigestion." Which was tolerable radical for a come outer to say, seems to me. End of Story 10